Hello and a warm welcome to this webinar on marketing localization called When Translation is Not Enough, Your Guide to Marketing Translation. Before I hand over to today's presenter, I just want to go over some housekeeping. We will keep you muted during the whole presentation, but do feel free to write questions in the chat and we will reply to your questions at the end. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our website, so you can watch it again if you want to. Today's presenter is Vera Nordén. Vera is the product owner of Marketing Solutions, and she is in charge of our marketing services portfolio. Now I will hand over to Vera so she can guide us through the ins and outs of marketing translation. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So let us first have a look at the agenda of the topics that we will cover during today's webinar. We will start by looking first at why we should localize instead of translating. Then we will have a look at some of the key differences between translation, copy adaptation, transcreation, and copywriting. We will also look at when you might need a creative service. Then we will also have a look at some multilingual marketing best practices and things to think about to set up your next localization project up for success. And then at the end, we will wrap up with some key takeaways, and after that, we will have time for some questions. So let's start then. Why localize instead of translate? Well, when you translate your marketing materials for new markets, it is important that the translated content has the same effect as the original material and that you connect with your local audiences. And in order to create content that resonates with the target audience in the new market, in most cases, we cannot just translate word for word into the new language and assume that the readers of the translated content will understand or connect with the message. If we do this, there is a risk that all the investment that went into creating the original source gets lost in the other markets. And there are a few examples of what can happen if we go for a direct translation of a marketing campaign or a slogan. The first example is from the American fast food chain KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken. In 1987, KFC entered the Chinese market, and when their famous slogan, "Finger licking good," was translated into the local language, it came out as "eat your fingers off," which was of course not the intended message that they wanted to convey. And another example is the Got Milk campaign from California Milk Processor Board. The campaign was released in 1993 with a message in English, "Got Milk." And what happened when this was localized into Spanish was that the phrase came out as "Are you lactating?" in Spanish. And luckily, in this case, the board caught the mistake before it was released, but it still shows that how important it is to make sure that the target languages are given as much attention as the source language was given. And one final example is from the American airline company Braniff International Airways. In 1987, Braniff wanted to promote its comfortable leather seats with the slogan "Fly in leather." And when this campaign was localized for Mexico, it was translated literally into Spanish and was received as "fly naked." And this is also an example of how a literal translation can distort the original message. And what the examples in the previous slide shows is that before we localize marketing materials for other markets, we need to make some considerations. And some examples of things we need to consider are cultural differences like religion, traditions, and values. We also need to consider different legal requirements and national standards of each market. For example, eco-labels may differ between markets, and then you might need to adapt the content to reflect this. We also need to consider the service or product offering. Does it differ in any way between the markets you are operating in? For example, you may have a product where a specific feature is only available in some of your markets, and then you might want to remove that in some of the languages. We also need to consider the level of brand awareness. Does it differ in any way between the markets? If you are, for example, entering a new market, the communication needs to be different compared to how you communicate in your home market, where your brand is more established and well known. We should also consider brand names and product names. Do they mean something in the target language? Do they mean anything inappropriate? Because in cases like this, you will want to consider to market your brand or products under another name. And finally, we should of course consider the relevancy. Is the message relevant to the target audience in the local market? Maybe in some cases, if you have, for example, a local campaign where you refer to local holidays or events, or you are referring to a local celebrity, then it can make more sense to create something completely new for a specific market. And now let's have a look at translation and localization and how these two differ from each other. And first, one key difference is the level of faithfulness to the original source text. Translation is strictly faithful to the source text. In translation, the target text should not deviate from what is said in the source text. Localization, on the other hand, goes beyond simply translating the content from one language to another. Localization adapts the content to the new local context. For example, you may localize or convert to local currencies and units of measurement, for example. Another difference is that translation does not take any cultural considerations into account. Localization, however, does consider culture. So whenever you would have a cultural reference used in the source text, that would not be understood by the new target audience. For example, a reference to a local holiday or a celebrity. Localization would adapt and replace the cultural reference with a cultural equivalent from the local market. Another difference is that translation does not consider visuals like colors, fonts, and images. The same visuals that are used together with the original source text are also used in the target text as well. Localization, on the other hand, does consider visual aspects and adapts these so that they are culturally relevant for the new market. For example, colors may have different connotations in different markets. And if we take just an example, in many countries, the color yellow transmits the idea of joy and positive energy, while in Latin America, yellow is associated with death and grief. And in localization, this difference is something that you would then consider. And finally, another difference between these two is that translation usually allows for a more automated process than localization. For example, the translation process is often supported by machine translation and translation memories, which can help speed things up. And localization, which can use some forms of automation, requires a much higher degree of human engagement during the process. And a very famous example of localization used in a global marketing campaign is the campaign Share a Coke from Coca-Cola. And this campaign, which has been a huge success all over the world, didn't just rely on translation. And one of the main reasons for the campaign's success is that Coca-Cola localized the name of the campaign into each market and didn't just translate it directly into each language. They also replaced the names on the bottles in each country, so that the bottles in each country had names that were the most popular ones in that specific country. For example, in the US, names like Chris, Kylie, Jason, Matt, and so on were used, while in Italy they used names like Francesco, Alessandro, and Laura. And in this way, people could relate more personally to the names and connected more closely with the message. And this example from Coca-Cola is a great example of how to use localization to better connect with the local audiences in each country. And now let's have a look at some of the key differences between translation, copy adaptation, transcreation, and copywriting. And before we go into the more creative services, let's first have a look at translation. How do we define translation and what sets it apart from other services? Well, if we first look at the definition of translation, it is the process of transferring a written text from one language to another, while maintaining the original message and communication. So what this means is that a translation service is strictly faithful to the source text, and it does not take any cultural aspects into consideration. It is a literal word-for-word translation from one language to another. And this is a service that is suitable when the content you want to translate is free from local references and when you want the content and structure to stay exactly the same in the target language. Some content types that are usually a good fit for translation are technical and legal documents, and any other type of content that is structured and repetitive. Types of content that are usually not a good fit for translation include, for example, marketing copy that uses creative writing techniques like rhyme, puns, idiomatic expressions, or content that is intended to engage the reader and sound as if it were written in the local language. And translation is performed in a translation tool, which allows for the support of machine translation, translation memories, and glossaries. And these technologies can be very useful to help speed up the translation process and to make sure that the language used is consistent, in line with previous translations stored in your translation memory, and that the correct terminology for your brand and industry is used. And translation is performed by translators who are native speakers of the target language. They are also specialized in the required subject area. And as part of the translation process, a translator will make sure that the target text is grammatically correct. The translator will also make sure that the source content has been fully replicated and that nothing has been left out or added. Now, let's look at copy adaptation. What is it? Copy adaptation is a creative translation that adapts the text to the local market's target audience and culture, far from a direct replication of the source text. So copy adaptation goes beyond just translation. It is a creative process that aims to produce a target text that maintains the tone and style of the source text in a way that is effective, appropriate, and natural for use in the target market. This can involve, for example, converting to local currencies, units of measurement, and making other types of changes based on culture. And the linguists will work to ensure that the language flows naturally and reads as if it had been originally created in the target language. They will also place a greater focus on the core parts of the texts, like the headlines and call to action. And this service is a good fit for creative content with high branding value, such as website copy, social posts, brochures, and other marketing texts. And when it comes to the process, copy adaptation is usually performed in a translation tool, just like translation. And just like for regular translation, the copy adaptation process is usually supported by translation memories and glossaries. However, one major difference with translation is that copy adaptation does not use machine translation, which is not helpful when adapting creative content. Another difference between translation and copy adaptation is how text is separated within the translation tool. For translation, text is split sentence by sentence to help ensure a strict adherence to the source text. However, for copy adaptation, the text is split into paragraphs, which gives the linguists the freedom to move around words and sentences and to restructure the text within each paragraph. And copy adaptation is performed by linguists who excel at adapting copy and have capabilities closer to a copywriter than a translator. They are native speakers of the target language and are specialized both within marketing and the required industry and subject area. Now, let's move on to transcreation. What is transcreation? Transcreation means recreation and full market adaptation of a source text to optimize impact and relevance for the target market. And transcreation is a highly creative process that goes one step further than copy adaptation. It is the process of taking the meaning from one language and then recreate it in another language. And so this is not a direct replication of what the source says. It is more about transferring concepts than words. And in transcreation, you do start from a source text, but rather than doing a direct translation or an adaptation of it, you allow the transcreator the freedom to recreate the meaning from the original source to make it fully culturally relevant for the target market. And in doing so, the transcreated text has a better impact on the local audience. And transcreation is usually a good fit for short, highly creative and high visibility content, such as ads, headlines, slogans, and taglines. And in contrast to translation and copy adaptation, transcreation is performed without using a translation tool. So this means that there is no support from a translation memory or machine translation, and the transcreator works offline to give free rein to their full creativity. And the transcreation process differs from translation and copy adaptation in that the transcreator will provide multiple options for each short text in the target language, together with back translations and a rationale to explain the choices made and the reasoning behind them. And what sets this service apart from translation is that translation is performed by professional copywriters. Transcreation are native speakers of the target language and are based in the target market. They also have extensive knowledge and experience in replicating meaning from one language into their own culture. And finally, let's have a look at copywriting. Copywriting is fundamentally different from the other services because it isn't based on a source text. It is the process of producing content from scratch based on a brief. And this service is useful for creating content in your main home market or for your international target markets when it makes sense to create something from scratch for a local market, like a local campaign, for example. Copywriting is also ideal when you would like to create source content that will then be translated or adapted to other markets. And copywriting is therefore suitable for all types of marketing content. And just like copy adaptation and transcreation, copywriting takes cultural aspects into consideration. And finally, copywriting is performed by a professional copywriter. Now, let's have a look at when you might need a creative service. So, well, there may be many situations when a word-for-word translation doesn't make sense. This can happen, for instance, when the preferred style and tone of voice differ between markets. For example, when a source text has an informal tone and a more formal language is needed for another market, then the content might need to be adapted to fit the more formal tone. A creative service might also be necessary if the product or service offering differs between markets, because then you might need to adapt the content to reflect these differences. Cultural differences between markets can also give rise to using a more creative service. A concept or an idea might not be well received or understood in the new market, so adapting or recreating the content with the new market in mind might be necessary. A creative service can also be a good fit when there are local nuances in the text, like idiomatic expressions or local references. Because if things like these are translated with a word-for-word approach, it could lead to misunderstandings. And texts with highly creative writing techniques like rhyme, alliteration, puns, poems, and so on, cannot be translated using a word-for-word approach. In examples like these, you would be better off using a more creative approach when localizing. And finally, whenever humor is used in your source content, it might be a good idea with a more creative approach to make sure that the target text has the same desired effect in the new target market. And some of the content types that usually require a more creative approach include ad copy, headlines, website copy, landing pages, social media posts, and slogans and taglines. And these are just a few examples. What type of content require a more creative approach can, of course, depend on many different factors. And if you think you might need a creative service, but you're not sure, then we are more than happy to help you. So please reach out to us if you need help making this assessment. And now let's have a look at some multilingual marketing best practices and some of the things to think about to set up your next marketing project up for success. And also to make sure that your communication stays on brand for all languages. So first of all, it is a good idea to set up a bilingual or multilingual glossary with the approved terminology specific to your brand and industry. And this glossary can also include forbidden terms that you do not want to be used. And having a glossary will ensure consistency in your translations over time. It will also reduce the need for post-translation edits, which will save you time and money. We also recommend having a style guide, a collection of your writing standards, tone of voice, and stylistic preferences. And this is a great complement to the glossary for the linguists, as it does not only give them the guidelines for which terms to use or not use, but also in what style they should use them. For example, if the language should be formal or informal, for example. It can also really help to have a team of preferred linguists who work as dedicated resources on your projects. This is also something that will improve consistency over time. And here it is good to keep in mind that it can take some time for the linguist to get to know your brand. And while they will be, of course, specialized in the required subject area and industry, we recommend that you provide them with instructions and feedback, which will help them learn about your brand and preferences, because this will lead to fewer edits in the long run. And for this reason, we recommend that you have the translations reviewed by local market experts to ensure that the translations are in line with your brand guidelines. And these changes will then be looped back to the linguists and updated to your translation memory. And it is also good, of course, to have a good translation memory strategy in place. And a good strategy when it comes to the translation memories will make sure that you get the best possible reuse from previous translations stored in your translation memory. And here it is also important to make sure that all the edits that you make are updated to the translation memory and that you keep it in good shape. And finally, to help the linguists create the best possible content for you, it is also important to provide them with a clear brief. The brief will help them fully understand your company and its goals, the target audience, and products and services. It is also good to include any relevant reference materials like images, brand guidelines, and previous texts that you are satisfied with. And for specific projects, make sure to also include specific instructions, such as any currencies or units of measurement that should be converted, any length restrictions, or any local or cultural references that need to be localized. And so this was what we had prepared. We will now just wrap up with some key takeaways before we move to questions. And yeah, some of the key takeaways. Translation is strictly faithful to the source and makes no cultural considerations. Localization adapts content, and it does take cultural aspects into account. Copy adaptation, transcreation, and copywriting consider culture. And finally, in global marketing, translation is sometimes not enough. So this was it, and I will now hand over to you, Linda, to see if we have any questions.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation, Vera, and we do have some questions. When you are mentioning marketing materials, do you refer to digital assets or do you also mean printed materials? Do Semantix help with the printed marketing assets such as flyers, leaflets, etc.?
Yes, so when we refer to marketing materials, this can be both digital assets and offline assets. So, for example, print materials. And when it comes to print materials, we do definitely help with that. And one thing that can be good to consider in cases like that, which I didn't mention in the presentation, is that whenever you localize, we can expect that the target text will swell a little bit. So there will be some adjustments needed to in the layout to make sure that the material is ready for print. And we are able to provide that service as well if needed. I hope this answered the question.
Okay, let's take another question. Are there any cases when a normal, quote-unquote, translation can work for marketing content?
Yes. So there may be some cases when a normal or a regular word-for-word translation can work for marketing materials. And that can be, for example, if you have a source text which is not very creative and which is also free from any local nuances. So, for example, there are no cultural references that would not be understood by the new target audience in the source text. And also, if you want that piece of content to be the same content to be replicated in the new language, then it can, in some cases, make sense to have a regular translation. But if it is marketing content, we would still, of course, not apply the same type of workflow or work with the same type of linguists, because we would still work with linguists who are specialized in marketing. So I hope that also answers the question.
And another question, why is machine translation not used as a support for marketing content?
Yeah, so machine translation can work very well as a support for some types of content, and that is usually when you have a text that is very structured and repetitive, and but it does not usually work very well for creative content. In marketing, you often have things like idiomatic expressions. You also have a few things that are very connected to culture, and machine translation is not a very good support in those cases. And what is likely to happen if you run through a marketing translation through machine translation is that you will likely lose the original feeling that the source text had. So it will not really help the linguist, because they would need to rewrite a lot there. So it is not really a good idea in most cases to have that as a support for creative content.
And here's another question. It's very specific. Do you offer transcreation in French?
Yes, we do offer transcreation in French, as well as many other languages. We have a pool of global linguists working all over the world, and we're also part of a bigger family of companies within the Transperfect family. So also within that network, we have an extended pool of specialized linguists for these creative services. So yes.
And the final question, how does the process look when needing a service from you? Will you help us decide what services/combinations we need?
Yes, definitely. We can help make that assessment and recommendation for you, either on a project basis, or also define different recommended services for different content streams. Like if you have a lot of different content streams, like you have website content, and then you have other types of content where you might not need as a service that is not as creative, then we can, based on the different content streams, recommend services tailored to you, to that.
That was it. No further questions in the chat. And that means we have reached the end of this webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you want to find out more, please get in touch with us by using the link published in the chat. And we wish you a pleasant afternoon.